The fiddle stopped. Every soul in the Silver Creek dance hall turned at once, and Caroline Wallace felt the weight of their stares like a physical thing pressing against her chest, crushing the air from her lungs. She stood at the edge of the sawdust floor with her worn calico dress and her careful, pinned-up hair, and she understood with sudden, terrible clarity exactly what this moment was. It was not a kindness. It was a spectacle. Mayor Harlan Briggs had announced it with that particular smile he wore when he was doing something cruel while pretending otherwise. A dance for the schoolteacher, he had called it, raising his glass of whiskey so that the amber liquid caught the lamplight. Our Miss Wallace has been with us 3 years now, and we ought to show her our appreciation. The applause had been polite and hollow, the kind people give when they are not sure whether to feel sorry or superior. And then every man in the room had looked away. Not one of them stepped forward. Not the blacksmith with his broad hands and his kind face. Not the banker's son who had danced with every other woman twice already that evening. Not the ranch hands who normally fought over the chance to spin a girl around the floor. They all looked down at their boots or into their drinks or at some invisible fascinating point on the ceiling, and Caroline stood alone in the center of their collective pity like an exhibit in a traveling show. 3 years of teaching their children. 3 years of pouring her entire self into that one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town, battling dust and poverty and parents who thought reading was a luxury their children could not afford. 3 years of eating alone at the boarding house table, of walking home in the dark because no one thought to offer a lantern, of being the subject of whispered conversations that stopped the moment she entered the general store. She had told herself she did not care. She had told herself she was here for the children and the children were enough. She had been lying to herself for 3 years. The heat in her face was unbearable. She was about to turn and walk out to gather the shredded remnants of her dignity and carry them home when she heard the sound of boot heels on the wooden floor. Not hurried, not apologetic, deliberate, measured steps that parted the crowd the way a stone parts still water. She turned. He was leaning against the far wall a moment before, and she had noticed him only in the way you notice something dangerous, the way you notice a thundercloud building on the horizon and try to decide whether to head for shelter. The stranger who had ridden into Silver Creek 3 days ago with 2 guns on his hips and dust on his coat, and eyes the color of winter sky. The man the whole town was talking about in the same hushed, terrified tones they used to discuss flash floods and outlaw gangs. Peter Merritt walked straight across the empty dance floor, straight toward her, and not one person in that room made a sound. He stopped in front of Caroline Wallace. He removed his hat with one hand, and then, in a voice low enough that only she could hear the full weight of it, he said, "Miss Wallace, would you do me the honor of this dance?" The fiddle player, after a stunned moment, began again, and the entire town watched the woman they had pitied for 3 years take the hand of the most dangerous man in the territory and step into the light. 3 years before that night, Caroline Wallace had arrived in Silver Creek, New Mexico Territory, on a Tuesday in September of 1882, sitting in the back of a freight wagon because the stage had broken a wheel 12 miles out and no one had come to fix it for 2 days. She had walked those 12 miles herself with her trunk dragged behind her through the red dust, and by the time she reached the edge of town her boots were ruined, and her face was burned from the sun, and she was, by any reasonable measure, a wreck. She had accepted the position of schoolteacher at Silver Creek because she had no other options. That was the honest truth of it, the truth she had never told anyone in that town because admitting it felt like surrender. She had grown up in sin. Louis in a family that had once been comfortable, and then, through her father's illness and a series of financial disasters she had not fully understood until she was old enough to understand everything too late, had become decidedly not comfortable. Her mother had died when Caroline was 14. Her father had followed 3 years later. Her uncle had paid for 2 years of normal school because he believed education was a proper occupation for a woman in reduced circumstances, and then he had informed her that she was on her own. She had taught in a St. Louis school for 2 years, saving every penny she could, trying to build something that resembled a future. Then a letter had arrived from the New Mexico Territorial Education Office describing an urgent vacancy at Silver Creek, a mining and ranching community of approximately 400 souls, and the pay had been enough to make her pack her trunk. Silver Creek was nothing like what she had imagined, and everything she should have expected. It was a raw, unfinished kind of place, a collection of buildings that seemed to be arguing with the landscape about whether they had any right to exist there. The main street ran north to south, anchored at one end by a church that needed painting and at the other by the Silver Creek Saloon, which did not. In between were the usual businesses, a general store run by a man named Vickers who weighed everything twice and smiled never, a bank that kept its shutters half closed as though embarrassed by something, a blacksmith's, a doctor's office, and the Hartley boarding house where Caroline rented a room for $7 a month. Martha Hartley, who ran the boarding house, was not a cruel woman. She was a practical woman, which in Silver Creek amounted to nearly the same thing. She fed her boarders adequately and kept their rooms swept and expected them to be quiet and punctual and undemanding. She had observed Caroline's arrival with the assessing eye of someone accustomed to sizing up whether a person would be trouble, and had apparently decided that Caroline would be of the manageable variety of trouble, and had assigned her the back room on the second floor, which caught the afternoon heat but had a window that overlooked the schoolyard. The last teacher left in March, Martha had told her, pouring coffee at the long boarding house table. Before that one, we had one who lasted 11 months, and before that one 2 years. The winter of 1879 killed him. Not literally, he just couldn't take the isolation. Caroline had drunk her coffee and said she was not the type to be defeated by isolation. Martha had looked at her over the rim of her own cup with an expression that said she had heard that before. The schoolhouse was a single room built from adobe, with a plank floor and 8 wooden desks that had been donated by the Miners' Union in 1878 and had not been repaired since. The blackboard was a piece of painted wood nailed to the wall. The only books were a set of McGuffey's Readers, 2 arithmetic primers, and a tattered geography text that insisted the population of Denver was considerably smaller than it currently was. Caroline had spent her first 2 weekends sanding the desks, patching the cracks in the walls with mud she mixed herself, making curtains from a bolt of calico she bought with her own money, and writing to the Territorial Education Office requesting more books. The books had never come. She had written 6 more times over the following 3 years and the books had never come. What had come, eventually, were the children. 23 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 14, children of miners and ranchers, and the Mexican families who had been farming the valley for 2 generations before anyone else arrived. They came in dusty and suspicious, and in many cases, entirely convinced that school was a punishment imposed on them by adults who had forgotten what it felt like to be young. Caroline had met this conviction with patience and stubbornness in equal measure. She had learned to speak passable Spanish because nearly a third of her students needed it. She had stayed late on cold evenings to tutor the children who were struggling. She had bought breakfast with her own money for the children who arrived hungry, because there were always children who arrived hungry, and she could not teach a hungry child. The town respected her work in the abstract way that people respect labor they benefit from but do not have to perform themselves. The children, who were the ones actually transformed by it, loved her. Parents acknowledged her at church with nods that conveyed thanks and a certain wariness, as though too much warmth might obligate them to something. And among the adults of Silver Creek, particularly among the women, Caroline occupied a social position that she had come to understand, with painful clarity, was something close to invisible. She was 27 years old and unmarried, which in Silver Creek in 1882 was itself a kind of statement. not a statement Caroline had intended to make. She had simply never found the circumstances that other women seemed to find, or perhaps the circumstances had found other women and simply walked past her door without knocking. She was not ugly. She knew that objectively. She had a face that was interesting rather than conventionally pretty dark eyes that were too direct for some men's comfort, a way of holding herself that one of her boarding school teachers had called carriage, and which the men of Silver Creek seemed to interpret as unfriendly. She was careful with her dress because she could not afford otherwise. She was precise with her speech because imprecision had consequences she could not afford either. And she was alone in the way that only a woman in a small western town can be alone, surrounded by people at all times and connected to none of them in any way that mattered. The pity had begun almost immediately. She had seen it first in the way Martha Hartley talked about her to the other boarders, the slight lowering of the voice, the sympathetic shake of the head. Then in the way the women at church made room for her at the end of the pew, the particular kind of courtesy extended to someone who is expected to always be available because they have no one else. Then in the way her name came up in conversations she was not meant to overhear, poor Miss Wallace, all alone. What a shame, and she teaches so well too, you would think. She had developed a talent for not flinching. She had developed a talent for smiling in a way that revealed nothing and asking questions about other people, so that the conversation would never circle back to her. She had developed a very precise and detailed inner life that she kept behind her eyes and shared with no one. She had also developed, entirely against her better judgment and her considered self-interest, a quietly desperate hunger for something more than this, something that felt like being truly seen. Peter Merritt arrived in Silver Creek on a Friday afternoon in October of 1882, and Caroline heard about it before she saw him because in a town of 400 people news traveled faster than horses. She was at her desk after the children had gone home, correcting arithmetic papers, when Tommy Garcia, who was 9 and should have been home an hour ago, burst through the schoolhouse door with the specific energy of a child who has witnessed something extraordinary. "Miss Wallace," he said, breathing hard, "there is a man in town with 2 guns." "Many men in Silver Creek have guns," Caroline said without looking up from the paper she was correcting, in which 12-year-old Henry Briggs, the mayor's son, had demonstrated a striking inability to distinguish between multiplication and addition. 2 guns, Tommy said, with emphasis that suggested this was a crucial distinction. "And a scar, right here." He drew a finger along his jaw. "Tommy, you should be home." "He asked about the Delaney men," Tommy said, and this, finally, made Caroline look up. The Delaney men were the reason Silver Creek had a problem. They were 5 brothers, the remnants of a larger gang that had operated in the territory for the better part of a decade, and they had decided approximately 8 months ago that Silver Creek was a convenient location from which to conduct their business, which included cattle rustling, claim jumping, and a recent graduated interest in bank robbery. They had rented a ranch property 6 miles south of town. They visited Silver Creek regularly for supplies and whiskey, and to make it clear, through a combination of suggestion and occasional demonstration, that they were not men to be argued with. Sheriff Dobbins, who was 54 and had a bad leg from a horse fall 2 years back, and whose primary qualification for the position was that no one else had wanted it, had so far dealt with the Delaney situation by pretending it did not exist. The result was that Silver Creek existed in a state of low-level collective terror, the kind that people normalize because the alternative is to acknowledge that they are genuinely helpless. A stranger asking about the Delaney men was therefore significant. "Where did you hear this?" Caroline asked Tommy. "My father was at the general store. The man came in and asked Vickers whether the Delaneys still used the ranch on the South Road." Tommy's eyes were wide with the drama of it. "And Vickers told him yes, and the man said thank you and bought some cartridges and left." Caroline sent Tommy home and sat for a moment with Henry Briggs's arithmetic paper in her hand, and an uncomfortable feeling in her chest. Strangers who came to towns asking about dangerous men were either lawmen or men seeking revenge for some private wrong, and either possibility suggested that Silver Creek was about to become the setting for something violent. She had seen enough of violence, distant and close, to have no romantic illusions about it. She gathered her papers and walked home. She saw Peter Merritt for the first time at supper that evening. Martha Hartley had taken him in as a boarder, which was not unusual because the boarding house was the only respectable lodging in Silver Creek. He was seated at the far end of the long table when Caroline came down, and he stood when she entered the room, which nearly every man in Silver Creek had stopped doing after the first month of her residence. He was, she observed with the same careful attention she gave to everything, about 30 years old. Dark hair that wanted cutting, jaw that wanted shaving. The scar Tommy had mentioned, a thin line along the left side of his jaw, old and healed smooth. Tall enough that the door frames of the boarding house were a consideration. He wore a plain dark coat, and his guns were not on the table because Martha Hartley had a rule about guns at the table that she enforced with a severity that suggested she had dealt with violations before. His eyes, which she noticed because they were unusual, were a pale, clear gray, almost silver, the kind of color that seems lit from within. They had a quality of observation in them, a habit of precise attention that Caroline recognized because it was something she had cultivated in herself and rarely encountered in others. "Miss Wallace," Martha said, "this is Mr. Merritt. He will be boarding with us for a time." "Mr. Merritt," Caroline said, sitting down. "Miss Wallace," he said, sitting down after her. That was the entire conversation for that first evening. But twice during supper she looked up and found him watching her with that precise, attentive gaze, and twice he did not look away quickly the way most people do when they are caught staring. He simply held her gaze for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, and then returned to his food. It was unsettling and not, she admitted privately to herself, unpleasantly so. She went upstairs that night and told herself firmly that strangers who asked about the Delaney gang were trouble, and trouble was something she had enough of already. Silver Creek in the autumn of 1882 was a town trying to hold itself together. The mines that had given it its name were playing out, the rich silver veins that had brought a rush of settlers in the 1870s thinning to threads. Some of the miners had left. Others stayed, working harder for less, developing the particular grim stubbornness of men who have invested too much to quit. The ranching families were more stable, rooted in the land in ways that mining camps were not, but even they felt the squeeze of falling cattle prices and drought, and the Delaney problem, which no one named directly in public, but which hung over every conversation like smoke. Into this fragile, frightened community, Peter Merritt settled himself with remarkable calm. He spent his first 3 days in Silver Creek doing very little that was visible. He ate at Martha's table. He walked the town at odd hours, unhurried, the way a man walks when he is memorizing the layout of a place. He visited the saloon twice but drank sparingly, nursed a single glass of whiskey while he listened. He spoke to people with the economy of a man who chooses his words carefully and means every one of them. He was polite in a way that was not exactly warm but was genuinely courteous, the kind of courtesy that comes from genuine respect rather than social performance. Caroline observed all of this because her room looked out over the street and because she was, if she was honest with herself, more interested in Peter Merritt than was strictly sensible. She justified this to herself as reasonable caution about a potentially dangerous presence in her home. The justification was not entirely dishonest. On his 4th day, he knocked on the door of the schoolhouse. She was alone with her books and her preparations, and the knock startled her more than she would have liked. She called, "Come in," and he opened the door and stood in the frame, taking up more of it than she expected. "Miss Wallace," he said, "I apologize for the interruption. I was wondering if I might ask you something." "You may," she said, setting down her pen. He came in and sat in one of the student desks, which should have looked ridiculous and somehow did not. He looked at the room with what seemed like genuine interest, and she noticed him noticing the books she had arranged on the back shelf, the maps she had tacked to the walls, the student compositions hanging in a line above the blackboard. "You built this," he said. It was not quite a question. "The territorial office provided the building," she said. "The rest is assembled from your own pocket." She did not answer that because it was not a question either, and because it surprised her that he had deduced it. "I need information about this town," he said, "and I think you are probably the most honest person in it." "That is either a compliment or an insult to Silver Creek," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "A little of both. I won't pretend I don't know what you know about why I'm here. The Delaney's." "Everyone in town knows," she said. "What everyone in town doesn't know," he said, "is that I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because 3 months ago the Delaney's robbed a payroll wagon outside of Albuquerque and killed 2 men. One of them was my partner. We had worked together for 7 years. He said this without visible emotion, which somehow made it worse. I am a licensed investigator working under contract with the Southwestern Stage and Freight Company. I have papers from the Territorial Marshal's office. I am here to bring them in legally, not to start a war in the middle of someone's town." Caroline looked at him for a long moment. "And you are telling me this why?" "Because you teach 23 children in this schoolhouse," he said, "and because your schoolhouse is on the edge of town, and if something goes wrong, I need someone with sense to know what's happening and to keep those children safe." It was such a precise, practical, unexpected answer that she sat with it for a moment before speaking. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need to know the pattern of it," he said. "When do the Delaney's come to town? Which locals have dealings with them? Whether Sheriff Dobbins can be relied on." "The Delaney's come to town every Tuesday and Friday for supplies," she said. "I know this because they always pass the schoolhouse. My students know who they are and they know to stay inside when they come through." She paused. "3 families in town supply them, not willingly, I believe, but out of fear. Vickers at the general store is one. I won't name the others without more certainty." Another pause. "Sheriff Dobbins is not a coward exactly. He simply knows his limits. If you came to him officially with your papers from the Territorial Marshal, he would cooperate. He would be relieved to have someone else carry the weight of it." Peter Merritt watched her as she spoke. He had that quality of attention she had noticed at supper, fully present, absorbing everything, and when she finished he nodded slowly. "That is more useful information than anything I have gotten from 3 days of listening at the saloon," he said. "People talk to me because they assume I am not listening carefully," she said. He looked at her with those pale eyes and something shifted in his expression, something not quite named. "That must be a particular kind of loneliness," he said quietly. It was the most unexpected thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. She was not prepared for it, and because she was not prepared, something passed briefly across her face that she could not contain, a flash of recognition so sharp it felt close to pain. She covered it quickly, but not quickly enough. "Thank you for explaining your purpose," she said in her most composed voice. "I will help where I can." He stood, replacing his hat. "I know you will," he said. "You're the kind of person who does." He left, and Caroline sat in the schoolhouse with her preparations unfinished and her heart beating in an uncharacteristic, unruly way, and gave herself a firm internal lecture about the foolishness of being moved by a few well-chosen words from a stranger. The lecture was not particularly effective. Over the following 2 weeks, Peter Merritt visited the schoolhouse 3 more times with questions, and on each occasion stayed longer than strictly necessary, and the conversation wandered past the practical into territory that was, in a measured, careful way, something closer to personal. She learned that he had grown up in Ohio, that he had come west at 19 with the specific ambition of not spending his life in an office, that he had worked as a deputy marshal for 4 years before the stage company had recruited him for investigative work because he was, apparently, better at thinking than shooting, though he was good at shooting too. She told him less because she was accustomed to revealing less. But she told him about St. Louis and about normal school, and about the 6 unanswered letters to the Territorial Education Office, and he listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave to information about the Delaneys, which was to say, complete. She also noticed that he smiled more than she had initially thought. Not often, not extravagantly, but with an authenticity that was different from the social currency of smiling she saw in the rest of Silver Creek. When she said something that genuinely pleased him, there was this brief illumination of his face like light through a shutter, and she found herself, entirely against her better judgment, saying things designed to produce it. Meanwhile, the Delaney situation was progressing. Peter had visited Sheriff Dobbins with his papers from the Territorial Marshal's office, and Dobbins, exactly as Caroline had predicted, had been relieved to have the authority shared. There was no dramatic confrontation yet. Peter was methodical. He was building a legal case, gathering testimony, establishing the chain of evidence that would allow the arrest to stand in court rather than dissolve into a shooting that solved nothing permanently. The problem with violence, he told her one afternoon, sitting in the chair she had placed at the side of her desk for parent visits, is that it breeds more of itself. You shoot a Delaney, his brothers come back with more guns. You arrest him on solid evidence and get a conviction. The gang doesn't have anything to rally around. That requires patience most men in your position do not have, she said. I have patience, he said, and then in a different tone, quieter and more careful, for things worth being patient about. He was looking at her when he said it, and she felt her face warm in a way she could not entirely attribute to the afternoon sun through the schoolhouse window. She told herself again that this was imprudent. He was a man with dangerous work and a dark past written in that scar on his jaw, a man who would ride out of Silver Creek the moment his business was finished. She was a schoolteacher who had built a life, small and imperfect as it was, in this place, and she could not afford to pull on threads that would unravel it. She told herself all of this, and then she put on her best dress for the first time in 4 months on the evening of the Silver Creek Autumn Social, because Mayor Briggs had announced it as a community gathering, and it was professionally expected that she attend, and because she admitted only to herself in the privacy of her small back room, she wanted Peter Merritt to see her in something that was not a teaching dress. The Silver Creek Dance Hall was actually the converted grain storage building at the end of Main Street, cleaned and hung with paper lanterns for special occasions and smelling of sawdust and bay rum, and the particular anxiety of people who are trying to enjoy themselves in difficult circumstances. The social was a regular event, the town's primary mechanism for pretending that everything was fine and that they were a community rather than a collection of isolated individuals surviving in proximity to each other. Caroline arrived alone, as she always did, and took the glass of punch that Martha Hartley pressed into her hand, and settled into the comfortable invisibility she had learned to inhabit at these events. She spoke to people when addressed, smiled at the right moments, admired the new dress on the banker's wife, and asked after the health of the miller's youngest. She was pleasant and present and completely sealed off, a lamp burning behind glass. She saw Peter Merritt arrive 40 minutes after she did, and he was cleaner than she had seen him, coat brushed, hair combed, and she noticed with a complicated mixture of emotions that 3 different women immediately oriented toward him with the directional accuracy of compass needles finding north. Clara Briggs, the mayor's daughter, who was 20, and had the confident beauty of a woman who had never had reason to doubt her own desirability. Ellen Marsh from the dry goods side of the Marsh Ranch, who was 23 and known for being friendly. A third woman she did not know well. Peter accepted conversation from all 3 of them with courtesy and without any particular investment, and at some point across the crowded room, his pale gaze found hers. He held it for a moment. Then one of the women said something that required his attention, and he turned. Caroline looked down at her punch. The dancing started, and the room rearranged itself into its usual configurations. Men and women who were paired swirled across the sawdust floor, and along the edges, the unpaired ones watched and talked and tried to look as though watching and talking was exactly what they had come for. Caroline had long since made her peace with the edges. Mayor Briggs, who had drunk more of his own whiskey than was strictly wise, got up onto a chair to make a speech about community and persistence and the silver future of Silver Creek, which was met with the tired applause of people who had heard it before. And then, in the particular stroke of thoughtlessness that Caroline would later consider the accidental act of grace that changed her entire life, he called attention to her. "Our schoolteacher," he said, gesturing in her direction with his glass. "3 years of service to this community's children. Let's have a dance for Miss Wallace." The fiddle started. The crowd cleared a space, and no one moved. She had known it would happen. She had known it the moment Briggs pointed at her, and the knowledge had settled into her stomach like a swallowed stone. She could see the calculations happening in real time on the faces around her, the men looking at their boots or their drinks or the fascinating ceiling, the women watching with that mixture of pity and relief that means better her than me. She was 30 seconds away from turning and walking out when she heard the boots. The crowd parted. And Peter Merritt crossed the empty floor straight to her, hat in hand, and asked her to dance. She took his hand. His grip was firm and warm and entirely steady. He led her out onto the sawdust floor and put one hand at her waist with a correctness that was also somehow intimate, and the fiddle played and they danced. He was a better dancer than she expected, which surprised her into a genuine laugh. "You seem surprised," he said, very close to her ear. "You do not strike me as a man who dances," she said. "Everyone has hidden skills," he said. "What are yours?" "Besides teaching," she considered. "I can identify 12 varieties of edible plant in the desert. I can repair a clock mechanism. I can name every territory in the Union and its capital and its primary industry." "Remarkable," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I am not finished," she said. "I can go 3 weeks without human conversation without losing my mind. I'm an excellent reader of people who do not want to be read. And I am," she added before she could stop herself, "very, very tired of being pitied." He drew back slightly to look at her face, and what she saw in his expression was not pity. It was something warmer and more complicated than pity. It was recognition. "You are the least pitiable person in this room," he said quietly. "That I can promise you." The fiddle played. The town watched, and Caroline Wallace, for the first time in 3 years, did not feel invisible. What neither of them noticed, because they were otherwise occupied, was that Burke Delaney, the eldest of the 5 brothers, was standing in the doorway of the dance hall with 2 of his men behind him. He had come to town on a Thursday, which was not his pattern, and he had come later than usual, which was also not his pattern, and he stood in that doorway and watched the man the whole town was carefully not talking about dance with the schoolteacher, and his face held an expression that was not pleasant. Word had reached Burke Delaney that a licensed investigator with territorial marshal's papers was in Silver Creek, building a case. Burke Delaney was not stupid. He was a man who had survived in dangerous country for a decade by being a better reader of threats than most people expected, and what he read in the scene before him was a threat that was closer to catching him than he had previously understood. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway for perhaps 2 minutes and then turned and walked back into the dark. Caroline did not know any of this until the following morning. She was at breakfast when Peter came downstairs with his jaw set, and something in his eyes that was different from the warmth of the previous evening. He sat down across from her and told her in a low, level voice that Burke Delaney had been at the dance hall the night before, that he had been watching, and that this changed the timeline of the situation. "Changed it how?" she asked. "He knows I am working a case. He will not wait for me to finish building it. He will act first." He poured coffee and held the cup without drinking. "I need to accelerate the timeline." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, That things may move quickly in the next few days, and I need you to keep your children inside the schoolhouse from now until I tell you otherwise. Close the shutters. If you hear shooting, you do not come out regardless of what you hear." She looked at him across the breakfast table with the early light coming through Martha Hartley's checked curtains and said, "Are you going to be safe?" The question surprised him. She could see that. He had not been in the habit, she suspected, of people asking that. "I intend to be," he said. "Intend and will are different words," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those pale eyes, and then he said, "I know," and drank his coffee. She went to school and closed the shutters as he had asked, and taught her 23 children long division and the history of the Mexican-American War, and tried not to listen for the sound of gunfire. 2 days passed without incident. Then 3. The town went about its brittle, ordinary business, and Peter was less visible than usual, spending long hours out of the boarding house, talking to Sheriff Dobbins, talking to people Caroline did not know in places she did not see. She saw him only at breakfast and at supper he ate quickly and was mostly silent. On the morning of the 4th day after the dance, Tommy Garcia arrived at the schoolhouse 45 minutes early, his face pale under his brown skin, with news that Burke Delaney had threatened his father the previous evening. The elder Garcia ran the only Mexican-owned business in Silver Creek, a small leatherworking shop, and the Delaneys had been using him for months as an unwilling supplier of saddle repairs for their stolen horses. Caroline settled Tommy into a seat with a piece of cornbread and let him talk, and what he told her confirmed several things she had suspected and gave her one piece of information that she immediately recognized as important. She spent the entire school day in a state of controlled agitation, and at 3 o'clock when the last child had left, she wrote a note and sent it to the boarding house by the reliable hand of 9-year-old Rosa Vega, who lived next door to the Hartleys and could be trusted to deliver it without reading it. The note said, "The Delaneys have someone in town feeding them information about your movements. I think I know who. Come to the schoolhouse at your convenience." He was there in 20 minutes. She told him what Tommy had told her, and what her own observations over the previous weeks had assembled. There was a man named Cord Sayers who worked at the livery stable and who had, she had noticed, a habit of sitting outside the stable's entrance whenever Peter left or returned to the boarding house, always at the same bench, always appearing to do something that required him to be facing the main street. "He is watching when you come and go," she said. "I believe he is reporting to the Delaneys." Peter sat with this for a moment. "How did you notice?" "Because I walk home past the livery every day," she said, "and I notice patterns. It is a teacher's skill." He nodded slowly. "If Sayers is their informant, then they know I went to Dobbins. They know the case I am building." He looked at her with an expression that was partly professional calculation and partly something more personal. "Caroline." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed differently than she expected, warm and deliberate, not a slip. "If things go badly," he said, "I want you to have this." He put a folded paper on her desk. "It is a letter to the stage company in Albuquerque with my partner's name on it. His family is in Iowa. There's a widow and 2 children. The company owes them compensation and they have been stalling. The letter has the evidence they need. If something happens to me, stop," she said. He looked at her. "Do not talk to me about arrangements for what happens when you are dead," she said, with a precision that she was aware was covering something unsteady beneath it. "Talk to me about the plan for what happens when you are alive." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite the smile yet, but closer to it than she had seen in days. "The plan," he said, "is that I go to Dobbins tomorrow morning. We have enough for the arrest warrants. I have testimony from 4 witnesses, including your Garcia family. We go to the ranch on the South Road with a federal warrant, and we do this properly and legally, and no one has to get shot. And if the Delaneys do not cooperate with the concept of doing things properly, then I am very good at my job," he said, "and I intend to come back." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and there was something in it, a declaration of a kind that did not require any specific words but was entirely clear, and she held his gaze back and let him see whatever was in her own eyes, because she was tired, finally, of keeping everything behind glass. The arrests were made on a Friday morning, 5 days after the dance. Peter and Sheriff Dobbins rode out to the Delaney Ranch with federal warrants signed by the Territorial Marshal's office and 2 of Dobbins' deputies, who were young and not entirely steady but present and armed. Caroline did not see the departure. She was teaching. She kept the shutters half open because the children were getting restless and the morning light was gentle, and she taught them geography and read to them from a novel she had brought from St. Louis, and she kept her voice perfectly level throughout. At approximately 10 in the morning she heard a single shot, then silence. She closed the book and looked at her 23 children who were all looking at her, and she said in her most ordinary voice, "Close the shutters, please," and kept reading. At 12:30, Tommy Garcia, who had a view out the back window that overlooked the South Road, said quietly, "Miss Wallace, someone is coming." She went to the window. Peter Merritt was riding up the South Road with Dobbins beside him and 4 of the Delaney brothers in irons behind them on a line. She counted the faces. There were only 4. "Where is the 5th?" she asked, mostly to herself. "Burke Delaney got away," Tommy said, reading something in the distance she could not. "Papa is going to say he got away." This was not the perfect resolution. Burke Delaney free was a loose thread. But 4 arrests with federal warrants with a legal case built from proper testimony was not nothing. It was in fact something considerable. She dismissed school an hour early. She was at the boarding house door when Peter rode in, and he dismounted in the street with the same economy of movement he did everything, and he looked up and saw her standing there, and the relief that passed across his face was, she thought, as honest a thing as she had ever seen from another person. "4," she said. "Burke ran," he said. "I have a telegraph out to the marshal's office." "He won't get far." "Are you hurt?" "The shot you heard was Dobbins' youngest deputy, who fired at a horse and missed," he said. "Everyone is fine." She looked at him for a moment and then did something she had not calculated or planned. She stepped forward and put her arms around him briefly, firmly, the way you hold onto something you have been frightened of losing before you have even understood that you are frightened of losing it. He went very still for a moment, and then his arms came up and held her back, and his chin rested briefly on the top of her head, and they stood like that in the middle of the Silver Creek Main Street for approximately 5 seconds before she stepped back and composed herself with great dignity. "I am glad you are alive," she said. "So am I," he said, and his voice was not entirely even. Burke Delaney was apprehended in Tucson 11 days later, intercepted by the Territorial Marshal's office on the information Peter had telegraphed. The Albuquerque newspaper ran a story about the Silver Creek arrests that referred to Peter Merritt as a skilled investigator and said complimentary things about Sheriff Dobbins, who was pleased enough to buy a round at the saloon. The town exhaled. There is a particular quality to community's mood when a long-held fear is finally removed. It is not immediately joyful, but rather slowly warm, like a room gradually filling with heat after a fire is lit. People talked more easily on the street. Children played farther from their parents' sight. The families who had been supplying the Delaneys under coercion came forward in ones and twos to give their testimony and were treated with the decency that frightened people deserve. Caroline noticed all of this with the particular attention she gave to everything, and she noticed something else as well. The way people spoke to her was changing. She could not have named exactly when it began. It was gradual, an accumulation of small things. Martha Hartley asked her opinion at breakfast, genuinely asked it, about whether the boarding house needed new curtains. The banker's wife stopped her after church to say that her son had come home from school the previous week and asked whether she could teach him some Spanish too, and was that possible? Vickers at the general store, who had never done more than weigh her purchases and collect her money, told her that his daughter was reading better this term than last and that he appreciated it. She suspected that Peter Merritt had something to do with this. She suspected that he had said things to people, Not many things, not a campaign, but that he had a way of conveying the value of something so clearly that the people around him adjusted their understanding without quite realizing they had been instructed. She did not ask him about it directly. She filed the suspicion away with some warmth. What she did ask him about, one evening when they were sitting on the boarding house porch in the October cool with the stars very clear above the desert, was what he was going to do now that the case was closed. He was quiet for a moment. She could see his breath in the cool air. "The stage company has another contract for me," he said. "In Arizona territory, stage robbery, 3 men killed." She nodded. She had known this was coming. She had been knowing it in the way you know a season is ending before the air actually changes. "I have been thinking," he said very carefully, "about whether I want to take it." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars. "There is a version of my life," he said, "where I keep doing this work which I am good at and which is necessary and which honors what happened to my partner. And there is another version, which I have been thinking about considerably more than is probably professional, which involves this particular town and one particular person in it, and whether a schoolteacher with very good reasons to be cautious would be willing to have a conversation about the future." The careful formality of it, the precision he had deployed because he was a man who chose words deliberately and was choosing these with great care, made something in her chest feel simultaneously full and fragile. "I am cautious," she said. "I am cautious because I have had reason to be, but I am not," she added, "afraid." He turned and looked at her. "There are things I would need," she said, in the practical tone she used when she was protecting something that mattered. "I would need to know that you are here in Silver Creek and not somewhere else. I would need honesty, which I believe you are already constitutionally incapable of withholding. I would need time because I do not move quickly in matters that are this important." "I am patient," he said. "I told you that." "You did," she said. "I remember." The stars were brilliant and the night was cold, and they sat together on that porch for another hour without any additional declarations, which was exactly the right pace for two people who had both learned, through different roads, to be careful with their hearts. He sent the telegram to the stage company declining the Arizona contract the following Monday. He told Caroline over breakfast, simply and without ceremony, and she looked at her coffee cup for a moment and then looked up at him and said, "Good," in a voice that conveyed considerably more than the word itself. He began the process of making Silver Creek something more permanent. He spoke to Dobbins about whether there was interest in a properly funded investigative capacity for the county, given the territory's growth and the limitations of a one-man sheriff's office dealing with jurisdictions that stretched across 200 miles of desert and canyon. Dobbins, who was tired and honest enough to admit it, thought this was an excellent idea and wrote to the county commissioner. The county commissioner, who had been embarrassed by the Delaney situation and was looking for ways to demonstrate competence, wrote back with an offer. Peter bought a lot on the north end of Silver Creek's Main Street. The purchase was the kind of fact that spreads through a small town within hours, and its implications were understood immediately by everyone, including the people whose daughters had oriented toward him like compass needles on the evening of the dance. The mothers of those daughters processed this with the philosophical resignation of women who understand that some men are simply never going to choose the obvious options. Clara Briggs was overheard telling her friend that Miss Wallace was plain and peculiar, which was reported to Caroline by Martha Hartley, with an expression that suggested Martha found this both rude and incorrect. Caroline thanked her and did not particularly mind. She had long since stopped requiring other people's assessment of her for reference. What she did that autumn was something she had not done in 3 years in Silver Creek, which was to exist with a genuine quality of hope. Not the performative optimism she had maintained for her students' benefit, but the real thing, unpracticed and slightly unsteady on its feet, which occasionally surprised her in the middle of a lesson by surging up from somewhere behind her ribs without warning. Peter came to the schoolhouse on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and he sat in the parent's chair beside her desk, and they talked. About everything. About his childhood in Ohio, which had been large and ordinary in a way that still seemed precious to him. About her childhood in St. Louis, which had been quiet and then grief-shadowed and then determined. About books, which they had in common, with some passionate disagreements about relative merit. About the children in her schoolhouse, who he had begun to know through her descriptions so thoroughly that he could name most of them. He took to walking her home from the schoolhouse in the evenings, and this alone caused more adjustment in Silver Creek's social assessment of Caroline Wallace than 3 years of excellent teaching had managed. There is a particular cruelty in how a woman's value becomes suddenly visible to a community when a man of standing makes clear that he values her, and Caroline was honest enough with herself to feel the irony in it. But she was also pragmatic enough to accept that human beings are what they are, and that if the town was going to finally treat her like a full member of it, the exact reason was less important than the fact. She did mention this irony to Peter one evening, precisely because she knew he would understand and not try to smooth it over. "It is unjust," he said, directly and without qualification. "You built a school in this town with your own hands and your own money and taught their children 3 languages, and no one invited you to supper for 3 years. And now because I walk beside you in the street, they have decided you are worthy of basic human courtesy. That is unjust." "Yes," she said. "It is also," he said, "something you will be able to name clearly to the children you teach when they are old enough to understand it. What injustice looks like close up, what it does to people. How it functions through indifference as much as through active cruelty." She looked at him. "You are possibly the most useful person I have ever met," she said. "I am trying," he said, and then he stopped walking and turned to face her on the main street of Silver Creek in the early evening light and said, "Caroline, I would like to ask if I may court you formally, properly, with your full awareness that my intention is not temporary." She was quiet for a moment. "I am aware of your intention," she said. "I have been aware of it for some time. Yes, you may." He exhaled slowly, like a man releasing something held for too long. "Thank you," he said, with a solemnity that was not at all funny and which she found, for reasons she could not have explained, enormously endearing. The courtship of Caroline Wallace and Peter Merritt was conducted in the Silver Creek manner, which is to say, publicly and with the whole town watching while pretending not to watch. They walked together on Sunday mornings after church. He took her to supper twice at the hotel restaurant that had opened on the east side of Main Street in November, run by a Frenchman named Beaumont who was deeply out of place in the New Mexico territory, and produced the best food within 200 miles. They attended the next community social together deliberately, and he danced with her first and last and several times in between, and not one man looked at his boots this time. Tommy Garcia, who had appointed himself a sort of unofficial chronicler of the situation, reported all of this to his father, who reported it to his wife, who told her friend Sophia Reyes, who told Caroline about it one afternoon after school with the amused warmth of someone watching something finally go right. "The whole town is rooting for you," Sophia said. "Even the ones who were not very kind before. People feel bad about that, I think." "They should feel bad," Caroline said mildly. "But I will accept the change." She was happier than she had been in a long time. She was honest with herself about this, the way she was honest about everything. It was not simply that Peter Merritt was courting her, though that was a considerable part of it. It was that the courtship was founded on something real, on mutual understanding and genuine respect, and the specific pleasure of being known by someone who was very good at knowing things. They had talked so thoroughly about so much that she sometimes had the sensation of having been acquainted with him for years rather than months. He was also, she discovered gradually, and with some delight, a man with a very dry and specific sense of humor that he deployed sparingly, which made it more effective when it landed. He could make her laugh in a way that was rare for her, genuine and unprepared, a sound she did not recognize as her own laugh until it was already out. He was also, and she allowed herself to know this with a warmth that had no irony in it, very kind. Not in a conspicuous way, in the way that is simply woven into how a person moves through the world. He knew the name of every child in her school by December. He helped the Garcia family with a legal matter regarding their shop's title, pro bono, because he understood the law and they did not, and the injustice of that was something he could not leave unaddressed. When one of the mining families lost their mule to colic in January and could not afford a replacement, he quietly arranged for one. Caroline loved him. She knew this with the same clarity with which she knew geographical facts and arithmetic truths, not a fuzzy feeling but a solid, load-bearing recognition. She had not said it yet, because she was, as he well knew, a person who did not say things until she was entirely certain of their accuracy. She waited until February, when they had been courting for 4 months and the desert was cold and clear, and the two of them were walking along the dry creek bed east of town where the cottonwoods went to Silverwhite in winter, and she stopped and looked at him and said, without any particular preamble, "I love you. I thought you should know." He turned to look at her with those pale, clear eyes, and whatever was in his expression was the most undefended thing she had ever seen on a grown man's face. "I love you," he said. "I have been considerably less restrained about knowing it than you have, but I was waiting for you to be certain." "I am certain," she said. He stepped forward and kissed her, gently and thoroughly, standing in the winter cottonwoods on the dry Silver Creek bed, and the cold air was entirely irrelevant. He asked her to marry him in March, not dramatically but with the straightforward earnestness of a man who has decided exactly what he wants, and is honest about wanting it. He had a ring that had belonged to his mother, simple gold with a small pearl, brought from Ohio in a tobacco tin at the bottom of his saddlebag. "I know this is perhaps not the grand gesture the occasion calls for," he said, holding the ring with both hands in a posture that was not quite kneeling but conveyed the essential spirit of it. "But I also know you prefer honesty to performance, and what I want to say honestly is that I have never wanted to build a life with anyone before, and I want very much to build one with you, in this town where you have already built so much, and I think we would be exceptional together, and I would like very much for you to say yes." "Yes," she said, immediately and without hesitation, which was a first for her in matters of importance. The ring fit. She took this as a good sign. She wore it to school the next morning and said nothing about it, but Rosa Vega spotted it during the spelling lesson, and by noon the news had radiated through Silver Creek in all directions. Martha Hartley cried, which surprised everyone including Martha Hartley. Mayor Briggs, who was not a perceptive man but was a politically sensitive one, grasped immediately that congratulating Caroline Wallace with genuine warmth was both the right thing to do and the smart thing to do, and managed to accomplish both. Tommy Garcia told Peter with great seriousness that he was very glad about this, and that Miss Wallace deserved to be happy, and that if Peter was ever unkind to her he would hear about it. Peter shook Tommy's hand and said he appreciated the warning and intended to take it seriously. Tommy seemed satisfied. The wedding was planned for May, which gave the town enough time to be involved in the planning in the ways that small towns are always involved in such events, whether asked or not. They were married on the 14th of May, 1883, on a Saturday afternoon in the Silver Creek church that had gotten itself painted at last, white in the desert sun like something deliberate. Caroline wore the best dress she owned, pale blue with ivory lace at the collar, nothing extravagant but held with the particular dignity she brought to everything. Her hair was down, which she rarely allowed, dark and long, and the spring light through the church windows made everything warm. Peter stood at the altar in his good coat with his expression doing the thing it did when he was moved and was marshalling it, which Caroline could read as easily as she read her students. He watched her walk down the aisle and did not look away once, and when she reached him and took his hands, she could feel that they were not entirely steady. The reverend who married them was a new one, arrived from Cincinnati 6 months earlier, young and earnest, and he said things about partnership and faithfulness, and the particular bravery of two people choosing each other in difficult country. And the congregation listened with the warmth of people watching something good happen after too much that had not been good. They said their vows with the specificity that both of them brought to everything. Peter said his with his eyes on her face and his voice steady. Caroline said hers and meant every syllable with a precision that was more moving, she thought, than any dramatic performance could have been. Outside the church afterward, in the May afternoon with the desert blooming improbably around them, the whole town gathered with the food that Silver Creek women had been quietly preparing for 2 days: tamales from Sophia Ray's, pies from Martha Hartley, bread from the new baker who had arrived in April, and the dancing that followed in the street lasted until dark. Peter danced with her again, as he had at the beginning of all of this, and this time no one was watching in pity. They were watching in the particular pleasure that genuine happiness produces in the people around it, a reminder that joy is possible in hard country. "Last time we danced," Caroline said against his shoulder, "I nearly walked out first." "I know," he said, "I was watching. What would you have done if I had followed you out," he said simply, "and asked you there?" She laughed, that real laugh that was still slightly surprising to her. "Efficient," she said. "I have always been efficient," he said. The dancing went on in the Silver Creek street under the May stars, and the desert night was warm. The house Peter had been building on his lot on the north end of Main Street was finished by June. A solid adobe structure with 2 rooms that would become more rooms as they were needed. A proper kitchen with a cast-iron stove that was the finest piece of equipment in it. A covered porch that caught the afternoon shade. And a small room off the main bedroom that Peter had built without explaining his reasons. Caroline understood the reason when she stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at the dimensions of it and then looked at her husband. "You are very confident," she said. "I prefer the word optimistic," he said. She stood in the small room and thought about all the years in the boarding house back room with the afternoon heat and the window overlooking the schoolyard, and what it had felt like to be so thoroughly and completely alone, and looked at this man who had built a room for a child that did not exist yet, and felt the full weight of how much things could change. "I love you," she said again, because it was true and because she was less cautious about saying it now. "I know," he said. "I love you. Come see the kitchen. I need your opinion on whether I positioned the stove correctly." He had not. She told him so. He moved it. This was, she thought, an excellent model for a marriage. Their son was born in February of 1884, in that room Peter had built, attended by the doctor from the office on Main Street and by Sophia Ray's, who had become Caroline's closest friend, and by Martha Hartley, who had opinions about everything and stated all of them. He was born in the early hours of a cold morning with the stars still bright outside the window, and he was healthy and loud and apparently pleased to be present, which was a sensible reaction to his situation. Peter, who had maintained extraordinary composure through most of the life experiences Caroline had observed him through, held his son for the first time and lost that composure entirely, in a way that was beautiful to watch. They named him James, for Peter's partner who had been killed in the Albuquerque robbery. This felt right to both of them, a carrying forward rather than a dwelling. James Wallace Merritt was introduced to Silver Creek the Sunday after his birth, wrapped in a blanket Sophia had made, and was admired by approximately the entire town, including Tommy Garcia, who at 10 was acquiring the specific poise of a boy about to become an impressive young man, and who held the baby with such careful concentration that everyone laughed. The school continued. Caroline had thought about this while she was expecting, with the practical attention she gave to everything, and had concluded that there was no reason to stop teaching. She had spoken to the county commissioner, who had expanded his thinking about the Silver Creek school situation when Peter quietly pointed out the commissioner's interest in being re-elected by a growing voting population, and had secured funding for a second teacher, a young woman named Miss Edna Pierce, who arrived from Albuquerque in March and was frightened of spiders and excellent with arithmetic. Caroline and Edna Pierce divided the school between them with the efficiency of people who respect each other's abilities. And if some of Silver Creek's parents were surprised that Caroline came back to the schoolhouse 3 months after her son was born, Peter was not surprised at all. "You are not a person who stops," he said. "The children need teaching," she said. "Also, you would go mad at home," he said. "Also that," she said. He smiled, that full, illuminated smile that she still found remarkable. "I would have suggested a compromise. 2 days a week at home, 3 at school. I am already doing that. I know. I am simply noting that I would have suggested it if you had not already arrived at the correct answer independently." "That is very much the character of this marriage," she observed. "Is that a complaint?" "It is a compliment," she said, "and you know it." Peter's county investigative work proved as important as Dobbins had predicted, and as steady as a river. The New Mexico Territory in 1883 and 1884 was a place in active transition. The Lincoln County War had ended, but its aftermath lingered. Cattle rustling remained a constant problem. Claim jumping over the remaining silver and coal and copper was a source of continuous legal contest, and the arriving railroad was bringing new complications along with new connections. Peter worked within the legal framework, methodically and effectively, and built a reputation in the county for the kind of work that resolved things without unnecessary killing. He also built something less official but equally important, which was a working trust with the Mexican families and the smaller ranchers who had historically been the last priority of any legal system in the territory. He took their cases seriously. He made sure their testimony was recorded correctly. He noticed when their interests were being quietly subverted by more powerful parties, and made those subversions visible in the legal record, which is where they could be challenged. Caroline understood this as a core expression of who he was, not political ambition or self-promotion, but simply an inability to leave injustice unaddressed when it was something he could reach. She loved him for it, among many other reasons. They had their second child in 1886, a daughter they named Rosalind, who from the first weeks of her life demonstrated an opinion about everything and a willingness to express it that Caroline recognized with some amusement as a family trait. James, who was 2.5, greeted his sister with the cautious curiosity of a person encountering a new phenomenon, and decided within approximately a week that she was acceptable. Life in Silver Creek in the middle 1880s had a quality that Caroline sometimes thought of as hard-won peace. The mines were mostly played out, but the ranching economy had stabilized. The railroad spur that came through in 1885 connected them to Albuquerque and changed what was possible, what supplies could be had, what markets were reachable, what news arrived and how quickly. New families came. Some old ones left. The population balanced around 500 and began to feel like a real town rather than a frontier settlement arguing with geography about its right to exist. The school grew. By 1886, there were 31 children, requiring Edna Pierce's services full-time and Caroline's nearly so. The Territorial Education Office, perhaps spurred by some combination of the county commissioner's reports and the ongoing letters Caroline had never stopped writing, finally sent a shipment of books. Not all the books she had requested, not the complete set, but enough to make her cry briefly in the schoolroom after the children had gone home, which was the only place she allowed herself to cry. She told Peter about it at supper. "Good," he said, and then, looking at her face, "That is not an adequate response, is it?" "It is not quite adequate, no," she said. "You have been writing to those people for 4 years," he said. "That is a long time to believe in something that is not yet there." "Teachers have to believe in things that are not yet there," she said. "It is the entire job." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, simply held it, and she looked at him across the supper table with their children asleep upstairs and the lamplight warm between them, and felt the completeness of it. Tommy Garcia, who had been one of Caroline's first and most dedicated students, graduated at 14 in 1887 as the best student Silver Creek School had produced. He had a precise, analytical mind and a gift for language in both English and Spanish, and Caroline had been tutoring him privately for 2 years in subjects the school curriculum did not formally reach: history and advanced mathematics, and the kind of reading that opens doors. When it came time to discuss what came next for Tommy, it was Peter who sat down with the Garcia family, with Mr. and Mrs. Garcia, who had worked hard in hard country and who wanted for their son the things that hard country rarely made easy to reach, and talked about the practical paths forward. There was a law school in Albuquerque that was beginning to accept students from the territories. It was expensive. The stage company, for whom Peter had done a considerable amount of work over the years, had a fund for educational sponsorship. Tommy Garcia left for Albuquerque in the fall of 1887, carrying a trunk that Caroline had helped pack and a letter of introduction from Peter to a legal family in the city. He promised to write. He did write, every 2 weeks without exception, long detailed letters about his classes and his professors and the city, which Caroline read to the current students as a living example of what education could reach. She wept a little when he left, which she had not expected. He was 9 years old when she arrived in Silver Creek, and watching him ride south on the Albuquerque road was like watching a piece of her work become real in the world. "He is going to be extraordinary," Peter said, standing beside her as the wagon diminished on the road. "He already is," she said. "That is because of his own character and because of you," Peter said, which was the kind of thing he said without embellishment that landed like a stone in clear water. Their third child arrived in 1889, another boy they named Henry Thomas Merritt, who from the beginning was quieter and more observant than his siblings, and who by his 3rd year had developed a habit of following his father around the county office with a serious expression, and occasionally making comments about the cases that were, for a 3-year-old, surprisingly pertinent. "He is going to be a lawyer," Peter said. "He is going to be a judge," Caroline said. "That is a higher ambition." "I am a teacher," she said. "High ambitions are the product." Silver Creek in 1889 was not the Silver Creek of 1882. It had a newspaper now, the Silver Creek Courier, run by a retired printer from Kansas City who had opinions about everything and expressed them in print twice weekly. It had a library, which Caroline had organized and fundraised for over 2 years, a single room above the general store, now run by the affable and appropriately book-loving vicar's son, who had inherited his father's shop and very little of his father's personality. It had a proper schoolhouse, finally, with adobe walls and a real floor and desks that had been built that decade, and books on actual shelves. It had also Peter Merritt's county investigative office on the north end of Main Street, which had grown to include a part-time clerk and a working relationship with the territorial marshal's office that had solved 17 major cases in 6 years without a single unnecessary death, a record that would not be repeated by any comparable office in the territory for the following decade. And it had Caroline Wallace Merritt, who was no longer anyone's object of pity and had not been for years, who taught school in the morning and ran the library committee in the afternoon, and raised 3 children and a productive partnership with her husband, and who had, she thought sometimes in the quiet moments of the evening, built something real from the wreck that arrived on a freight wagon in September of 1882. Martha Hartley retired from the boarding house in 1890, selling it to a young couple from Colorado who painted it yellow, which suited it. She moved into a smaller house down the street from the Merritts and became a regular Sunday dinner guest, retained all of her opinions about everything, and was deeply fond of the Merritt children, who called her Aunt Martha, and raided her pie supply with a systematic persistence that she pretended to resent. The boarding house dinner table where Caroline had first seen Peter Merritt, where she had looked up from her coffee and found those pale winter eyes already watching her, was replaced by a round table that the new owners had brought from Colorado, and which was rounder and more social but somehow less storied. Caroline told this to Peter one evening with a nostalgia she had not expected to feel. "We could get a long table," he said. "It would not be the same table," she said. "No," he said, "but it would be ours." They got the table. It was long and made of dark walnut, and they filled it on Sunday evenings with family and friends, with the Garcia family and Sophia Reyes and her husband and Edna Pierce, who had married the new school board president in 1887 and had 2 children of her own now. With Martha Hartley and the Reverend, and sometimes the young reporter from the Courier, who was hungry for good conversation and willing to earn it. The table was loud and warm and full of argument and laughter, and the particular music of children who are being raised in a household where being heard is normal and expected. Caroline sat at one end of it, and Peter sat at the other, and between them was everything they had made. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, in May of 1893, Peter brought her to the dry creek bed east of town, where the cottonwoods went silver-white in winter and were in full green leaf now, and they sat together on the bank in the late afternoon light and did not say very much for a long time, which was comfortable in a way that only long intimacy makes possible. James was 9, a solid, cheerful boy who had his father's precision and his mother's stubbornness, and who was showing a strong preference for animals that suggested he would be ranching or veterinary work in his future. Rosalind was 7, all opinion and energy, already outpacing her older brother in reading and determined to catch up in everything else. Henry Thomas was 4, the watcher of the 3, quieter and deeper, with eyes that were sometimes, in certain lights, the same clear gray as his father's. 10 years, Peter said. "You are counting accurately," she said. "Remarkable achievement," he said. She laughed. "I think about that evening sometimes," he said, "in the dance hall. What it felt like when I walked across that floor." She turned to look at him. What did it feel like? He considered this with the care he gave to things worth considering. "Like something important was happening," he said. "I had not planned it. I had intended to stay at the wall and leave early because there was work the next morning. But I watched them all look away from you, and something in me that does not have a name decided that it was not going to stand for it." "Something in you," she said. "The part that knows what matters when it sees it," he said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the late light on the cottonwood leaves. "When you walked across that floor," she said, "I thought I was about to be the subject of another person's pity, one more kind gesture that would underline the fact of how alone I was. And then I saw your face," she said, "and it was not pity. I did not know yet what it was, but I knew it was not pity. And I thought carefully and against my better judgment that this was possibly the most interesting man I had ever seen in my life." "Interesting," he said, "not handsome." "Handsome was also noted," she said, "but less important." He smiled that full, unguarded smile. "Caroline," he said. "Peter," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask. Are you happy?" She held the question for a moment, feeling the weight of it and the weight of 10 years inside it, the hard work and the grief for what had been lost before him and the improbable, stubbornly persisting joy of what they had built since. "Yes," she said, "I am genuinely, fully happy, which I would not have believed possible standing in that dance hall." He reached over and took her hand. His grip was still firm and warm, exactly as it had been the first time. "I have something to tell you," he said. "Tell me?" "The stage company letter came today, the one from the regional director." He paused. "They are building a new territorial office in Albuquerque. Proper investigative division, federally supported. They want me to run it." She sat with this for a moment. Albuquerque was not Silver Creek. "It would mean leaving," she said. "It would mean leaving," he confirmed. "The school, the library, everything you have built here, everything we have built here." He paused again. "I turned it down." She turned to look at him. "Without talking to me first," she said carefully. "I knew what my answer was," he said. "I did not need to think about it. But I wanted to tell you about it because you should know that it was offered and what I chose." He looked at her steadily. "I chose this, Silver Creek, the house, the table on Sunday evenings." The children in that schoolhouse that you built from nothing. I chose you, which I have been choosing every day for 10 years and intend to keep choosing." She looked at him in the cottonwood afternoon for a long moment. "You should have asked me," she said. "I might have said yes to Albuquerque." Something flickered in his expression. "I would have understood it," she continued, "if we had talked about it together. We might have decided together that it was the right thing. We might have found a way for me to bring good work to Albuquerque too, because Albuquerque has children who need teaching and libraries that need organizing and injustices that need naming." He was quiet. "I am not angry," she said. "I am telling you for the future. We decide these things together, that is what together means." "You are right," he said. "I should have asked." "Yes," she said. "You should have, and next time you will." A pause. "If they offered it again," he said slowly, "would you want to consider it?" She looked at the cottonwoods and the late gold light and thought about Silver Creek, her school, her library, Tommy Garcia's letters from Albuquerque, the long walnut table on Sunday evenings, the small cemetery outside town, where the harder years of the territory's life were written in stone. She thought about Albuquerque, growing and complicated and full of people who needed the things she knew how to give. "I would want to talk about it," she said, "with you, together, as we should have done." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I will write back and say the matter was not fully resolved and ask if the offer holds." "That is the right thing to do," she said. "And whatever we decide," he said, "we decide together." "Yes," she said, "that is exactly right." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the May afternoon with the creek bed dry below them, and the cottonwoods making their particular sound in the light wind, and the sky above the desert going amber and rose, and the town behind them. 400 souls and a school and a library and a Sunday table, all of it built from nothing in hard country, all of it real. They wrote back to the regional director together, at the long walnut table, with James and Rosalind doing their schoolwork at the other end, and Henry Thomas asleep on a chair in the corner, with a kitten he had acquired without anyone's specific permission, but with widespread eventual acceptance. The letter said they were interested in discussing the position and its specifics, including whether the Territorial Education Board in Albuquerque had current vacancies for an experienced teacher with a curriculum in Spanish and English languages, and whether the position would allow for the continuing pro bono legal representation of the Mexican and indigenous families of the Albuquerque Valley, who historically lacked access to legal support. The regional director, who was a pragmatic man, wrote back that the Education Board did have a vacancy, and that the pro bono arrangement sounded like exactly the kind of thing that made a county investigator more effective rather than less. They talked about it for 3 evenings at the walnut table after the children were in bed. They walked through what Silver Creek needed and who could provide it. Edna Pierce had the school well in hand and had trained 2 additional teachers. The library had its own board now. Peter's office had a capable deputy who had been doing half the work already. Silver Creek was not anymore a place that needed them to survive. It was a place that would miss them and continue well without them. They told Martha Hartley first, who cried and then said she had seen this coming since the day Peter bought that lot on the north end of Main Street and built a room whose purpose was optimism. They told Sophia Reyes, who embraced Caroline for a long time and said she expected letters, and that this was not a demand but a condition. They told the school, which was the hardest thing. Caroline stood in front of 34 students on a Tuesday morning in July of 1893 and told them she was leaving at the end of summer, and the room was quiet with the specific quality of a silence that has feeling inside it. And then a girl in the second row, a 7-year-old named Pilar Soto, who had been in the school for exactly 1 year and had arrived unable to read a word of English, raised her hand. "Miss Wallace," Pilar said, "will there still be a teacher?" "Yes," Caroline said. "Mrs. Pierce will be here and Miss Navarro will be here, and there will be books on the shelves and the school will be open every day." Pilar considered this. "But will it be like you?" Caroline looked at this small girl and felt the full weight of what she had built here land on her chest all at once. "No," she said honestly. "It will be different. Things are always different after change. But Mrs. Pierce is excellent and she loves you all. And Albuquerque has children who need a teacher, and I need to go be that for them too." This seemed to satisfy Pillar in the way that honest answers often satisfy children when adults do not condescend. The last day of the Silver Creek school term that summer was a Friday, and the parents came with food, and the whole town came with the warmth of a community that has learned, somewhat belatedly, to show up properly for the people who matter, and it was a celebration that lasted until dark. Peter danced with her again, in the converted grain storage building that was the Silver Creek Dance Hall, and the fiddle played, and the same floor where she had nearly walked out 11 years earlier in the crushing silence of their collective indifference, was warm now with the noise and light of people who had chosen, finally and genuinely, to be her community. "How many times have we danced in this hall?" she said against his shoulder. "I have counted 15 occasions," he said. "You actually counted." "I remember every one of them," he said. "Some habits are worth keeping." She laughed. She looked around the room at the faces she had known for 11 years, at Martha Hartley dancing with the new reverend to everyone's visible delight, at Sophia's children chasing each other around the edges of the floor, at Edna Pierce discussing something serious with the school board president with the focused intensity of a woman who has inherited a serious job and intends to do it properly, at Tommy Garcia, who had come back from Albuquerque for the occasion and who stood at 6 feet with the bearing of a young man who was going to be formidable, watching the room with dark, thoughtful eyes, and at her own children. James at 9, already asking the fiddle player about the mechanics of the instrument. Rosalind at 7, dancing with extraordinary confidence in a circle of other girls, a natural organizer even in motion. Henry Thomas at 4, asleep on his father's coat in the corner, entirely undisturbed by the noise, with the kitten he had somehow transported to the dance hall curled against his stomach. She had arrived here in a wreck, with ruined boots and sunburned cheeks and no illusions about why she had come. She had built a life from the raw materials of hard work and stubbornness, and the patient belief that things done with love accumulate into something real. And a man with pale winter eyes had walked across an empty dance floor and asked her to dance, and the rest of it had grown from that. Not from pity. Never again from pity. From recognition and from choice, and from the quiet accumulated dailiness of two people who had decided to see each other clearly and keep choosing, every day, in all the ordinary moments that make up a life. They left Silver Creek on the last day of August, 1893, on a Tuesday morning when the desert was still cool, and the sky was the particular clear blue that precedes the autumn. The wagon was loaded with the children's things and Caroline's books and Peter's case files, and the walnut table, disassembled, because some things you take with you. Martha Hartley stood at the edge of the road with her handkerchief out and used it, and Sophia Reyes was there, and the Garcia family, and Edna Pierce with the school bell in her hands, as though she had brought it as a symbolic representation of the inheritance she was accepting. Tommy Garcia walked beside the wagon for a while, talking to Caroline with the ease of someone who had always known how to be honest with her. "You taught me to read," he said, "which sounds simple until you understand what reading opened for me." "You taught yourself," she said. "I was merely there." "You were not merely anything," he said. "You never have been." She held his gaze for a moment, this young man who had been 9 years old and frightened of multiplication, and who was now on his way to becoming someone whose name would mean something in this territory. "Write to me," she said. "Tell me everything." "Always," he said. The wagon rolled south on the Albuquerque road, and the town fell away behind them, and the desert opened up enormous and indifferent and full of possibility. The same desert it had always been, neither hostile nor welcoming but simply present, large and clear, and requiring everything you had. Peter drove because it was his turn, and Caroline sat beside him with Rosalind asleep against her side and James asking questions about Albuquerque that neither of them could fully answer, and Henry Thomas in the back with the kitten, watching the landscape with his pale gray eyes. "Are you all right?" Peter asked, quietly enough that only she heard. She looked at the road ahead, red dust running south toward the Rio Grande and the city and the new thing they were building together from the materials of who they had become. "Yes," she said, "entirely." He took one hand off the reins and found hers and held it, the same firm, warm grip, unchanged in 11 years. The wagon moved south. The desert opened before them. And Caroline Wallace Merritt, who had arrived in this country with ruined boots and a trunk full of determination and the lonely hunger of someone who had never been fully seen, looked out at the red horizon and felt the full weight of how completely, how irrevocably that had changed. She had been pitied once. In a dance hall on an October evening, when the fiddles stopped and the crowd parted and she had stood alone in the light of other people's condescension. And then a man had walked across the floor and asked her to dance. Everything good in her life had begun in that moment, not because of the man exactly, but because of what the moment had required of her. To take a hand that was offered, to step into the light, to stop allowing the weight of others' indifference to define the shape of her existence. She had been the teacher that Silver Creek pitied. She had become the woman who built its school and its library and helped shape the generation of children who would grow into the territory's future, and she had done it beside a man who saw her clearly from the first and had never stopped. The road ran south. The sky was enormous. Rosalind stirred against her side, small and warm and real, and beside her Peter drove steadily forward as he had always done, as she trusted he always would. Everything was exactly right.